Bon, alors, pour que tout marche cet après-midi linguistiquement, je vais parler en anglais pour qu'ensuite Stephen va parler en anglais pour qu'on puisse avoir un dialogue. Mais je vais tout de même capsuler les points que je fais en français. OK? All right.
Capsuler, ça c'est un mot qui n'appartient à aucune des deux langues. Donc c'est
parfait. Enfin, Didier m'a demandé que ça soit très court, les capsules. Donc, OK. So, thanks. Thanks, Stephen, for coming, too. So we're blessed with a marvelous collection of ethnographies and qualitative studies, thick descriptions that take us into the very core of the state. One of the most remarkable contributions of this collection of essays is the fact that we have here numerous sociologies of juridical and penal institutions, which typically is a barren area, really. In the United States, Malcolm Feely had a book on the process as the punishment, which looked at the juridical institutions. There was Bruno Latour's fieldwork on the Conseil d'État, Dominique Schnapper's account of the Conseil constitutionnel, but there wasn't much more. And here we have really a rich and voluminous number of ethnographic and participant observations of legal and penal institutions, and so this is a real triumph. We also have a deep probing in all of these papers into the moral economies and subjectivities of the agents who are at the heart of the state. Revealing, of course, the tensions, for instance, in Shaura Makari's paper, between the desire to individualize and the will to automate, pushing magistrates towards a normative bricolage of rational choice governmentality, or the local orders produced and the moral economies revealed in Nicolas Fischer's probing analysis of the juge des libertés et de la détention in the case of foreigners, the moral evaluations of the employment counselors in Sarah Mazou's ethnography, demonstrating these different moral compasses and how kind of punctuality, seriousness, posture, dress, manners, culture, or as she refers to it, leur culture, become important in these spaces. And Fabrice Fernandez's telling comment about the prison guards in the disciplinary context. And you hear their voices well and the moral economies that surround their voices with this statement, for instance, of the prison guards who says « C'est incroyable de voir un jeune homme de 22 ans tenir le discours qu'on a envie d'entendre, celui des psys. Gardez ces conneries pour vous. » Right? You have a whole sense of all of the kind of complex relations that are going on here. Now, in the short time that I have, what I'd like to do is focus on three theoretical concepts that form the spine of this collected work. And the three concepts are moral economies, political economies, and moral subjectivities. And I will start, of course, with moral economies. Bon. La capsule, c'est qu'on est blessed, on est béni d'avoir cette collection de travail ethnographique et qualitative sur ces institutions et que je vais me concentrer sur trois concepts théoriques, sur le concept de les économies morales, l'économie politique et la subjectivité. So, turning to the first question, what work is the concept of moral economies doing here? Now, the place to start, of course, is E.P. Thompson's work on the moral economy of the English crowd in the 18th century. And to recall that his project there was, in essence, to cast doubt on the notion of riot, on the notion of the food riot. To render legible concerted actions that were considered either chaotic or primitive or rational or non-political, and to turn them into political acts. In the very same way in which one would try today, for instance, to turn the London riots of 2008 from something that is perceived as having been an irrational outburst, right, into forms of concerted political action. Now, Thompson was able to render the food riots legible as political resistance by showing that they were, in a sense, a breakdown of a moral system, a moral economy which had been disrupted by the introduction of laissez-faire mechanisms. And the idea essentially was that there was a social contract, an agreed upon moral economy that had been broken, transformed, and that this transformation had produced what were perceived as hunger riots, but which were in fact political resistance. The brilliant move in Thompson's work, of course, is that he was able to take what looked like riotous folly, right, which was the fact that the mob, no longer the mob, but the crowd, right, was destroying mills, which was the production of food. That was in fact, and show that it was not senseless, that it was not irrational, but that it was actually directly related to the political and moral dimension of the struggle. Right? And it was precisely because they were attacking the mills that Thompson could then say, you know, this is a political act. It's not simply an irrational or just hunger. Now, Thompson, what's interesting here, of course, was applying this model of the moral economy framework to the crowd, to the dominated population, the class that in some sense in the political economy would have been subjugated. It functioned, by doing this, it functioned as a form of unveiling, but is an inverted unveiling. And it had a certain inherent critique to it, right? So by being able to expose the fact that these actions were in part of a political economic or moral economic framework, right? It was unveiling its political dimension. It's an inverted unveiling in Thompson's case because it's exposing the non-ideologically confused nature of the resistance, right? It's in contrast to ideology and false consciousness, which tries to get rid of that which hides true interests. It is in fact revealing that they were acting in some sense in pursuit of their interests, right? It's an inverted unveiling. They weren't suffering from some kind of false consciousness. And in the process of exposing the political dimension or the moral dimension, it serves to justify the rebellious acts. But notice, we're unearthing the moral economy of the dominated in some sense. And of course, this is true also of Scott's work, which is the moral economy of the peasants and the moral economy of political resistance. But again, it's the dominated class. These projects that we've heard for the last 2 days, by contrast, deploy that framework of moral economies to what are traditionally the repressing or dominating classes, to the agents of the state. Right? And so it's extending the framework, I think, to expose what could be viewed as a moral coherence, although complex, with lots of tension, lots of paradoxes, but nevertheless the moral framework of the agents of the state. And of course we can see and we hear the moral scripts of these state actors loudly in these papers. So for instance, in Karolina Kobylinski's paper, there's the example of the Russian couple and the agent's reaction to the Russian couple he's accused of corruption in Russia, and there's an extradition request for him. But there's the moral agency there is loud and clear. In Sébastien Roux's study of the PGG agents, the moment of crisis and the moral judgments about the flat screen TVs, right, in the room. In Jean-Sébastien Edelman's and Isabelle Couton's paper about adolescent education, the way in which they're trying to push the intervention onto the parents who are viewed as stronger, right? We see this as the moral economy, but we see it as a moral economy of the agents of the state. What we're rendering legible here does not operate in the same way. It turns, say, the brutality or the possible brutality of the prison guard into a more legible moral conduct. And it has a different relationship of justification to the moral economy, to the now possibly coherent moral economy. In this sense, it's a little bit more like Douglas Hayes' article, Property, Authority, and the Criminal Law in Albion's Fatal Tree, which actually was also edited with E.P. Thompson because he had a piece in there, but a very similar approach. But here it was the approach of trying to understand the moral economy of the dominating class. In that case, it was about capital punishment in 18th century England. And what Douglas Hay is able to show there is that the rash of death-eligible crimes, felonies such as, for instance, pickpocketing, right, as a capital offense, pickpocketing at an execution, right, a capital offense, the irony there, but that there was a moral economy that surrounded those efforts. It was an effort, for instance, to achieve social peace through a process of pardon and mercy, right? And so everyone could be sentenced to death, and the sovereign achieved some purchase on individuals by means of granting mercy. Almost a little bit in the same way as Chauhat's paper shows, kind of the severe punishment as a possibility, but then the granting of mercy as a way of creating these effective relationships. And of course, there's Edmund Burke's famous statement in Douglas Hayes' piece about the fact that all you need are, after a riot, all you need are 5 executions. He actually had the right number of executions, which would, in some sense, instill fear, but not too much, right? And so there was this imposition of a moral economy. But somehow, though, the unveiling of the moral economy of the ruling class, and which is a project to maintain power, does somewhat different work than when we're unveiling the moral economy of the dominated class. And it is not in itself justificatory in the same way. So then, what more do you need in order to achieve more of a kind of critical purchase on your materials? And I think this is where the question of political economies comes into the equation. So before I turn to the second concept here, political economies, let me try and encapsulate this in French. Donc, ce que j'ai essayé d'expliquer, c'est que le concept d'économie morale qui a ses sources dans le travail, entre autres, de E.P. Thompson, a été développé au début comme une manière d'essayer de comprendre l'économie morale d'une classe qui est plutôt dominée. Dans le cas de E.P. Thompson, c'est la foule. Dans le cas de Jim Scott, c'est les paysans. Et que le travail que ça fait, moral economy, est un peu différent quand on l'utilise sur la classe qui domine, plutôt que sur la classe qui est dominée. Enfin, c'est des schémas très simplifiés, bien sûr, dominé, qui domine, etc. C'est très simplifié, mais tout de même, ça fait du travail un peu différent parce que quand ça s'applique aux paysans, par exemple, ou à la foule anglaise, ce qu'on voit révéler, c'est une certaine cohérence morale, politique de leur activité. Ça transforme des actions qui étaient incompréhensibles en actions qui ont une justification morale politique. C'est légèrement différent quand on fait ce travail sur les agents de l'État, parce que à la fois ça crée des cohérences. Bien sûr, il y a des paradoxes et il y a des tensions. Donc, c'est pas qu'on est en train d'éclairer un système qui est complètement cohérent, mais quand même, ça rend legible, ça rend lisible les activités des agents de l'État, et donc, mais ça justifie d'une manière différente. En d'autres mots, ça ne justifie pas de la même manière, pas que le désir soit de justifier, mais tout de même dans le contexte de Scott ou dans le contexte de E.P. Thompson, de rendre lisible justifie d'une certaine manière, et pas bien sûr dans ce contexte ici. Donc la question c'est qu'est-ce qu'il faut ajouter, quel travail est-ce que ça fait, qu'est-ce qu'il faut ajouter pour qu'on ait une dimension plus critique. Étant donné, j'imagine que l'intervention n'est pas simplement de démontrer une économie morale pour simplement ensuite critiquer la dimension morale. J'imagine qu'il doit y avoir quelque chose de plus, qui est la question d'économie politique. Donc, deuxième concept, économie politique. So, second, the relationship between moral economies and political economies. So, in response to the question about the critical potential of moral economies, I heard, for instance, Didier yesterday in our conversation respond that by exposing the moral economy, it denaturalizes the moral economy and submits it to critique. Possibly denaturalizes, possibly demoralizes. I'm not sure if I heard I did hear demoralize, yeah? Demoralizes and denaturalizes. And by that, I understand Didier suggesting that it ties moral economy to a political economy. And this is something that is recurring in some of the papers. And so, for instance, in the introductory paper, décrire le travail moral des institutions, c'est dire que ce travail moral est indissociable des enjeux politiques qui sous-tendent les unes et les autres. Right? So, the moral economy, to describe the moral work of these institutions, is to reveal the moral work as inseparable, inextricably linked to political stakes. Also, in the last paper yesterday afternoon, the idea that l'économie morale de la sécurité est indissociable de l'économie politique de l'inégalité. Now, the key term here is indissociable, right? So the idea is to expose the moral economics to the simultaneously revealed political economic stakes. Now, notice that works for E.P. Thompson and it works for Douglas Hay. It works for E.P. Thompson in some sense automatically because the moral economy of the crowd is directly implicated to a political economy. And it's the rupture that laissez-faire brings to that political economy that causes the riots. In Douglas Hay also, there's an immediate kind of political economic dimension to what is being portrayed as an economic a moral economy. Sometimes, in some of these papers, though, I don't feel the connection as well between the moral economy and the political economic dimension. And so, for instance, but these, these are just some instances where, for instance, in our discussion yesterday with Fabrice about the term crapule, right, or maléfique, or zinzin, I'm not sure how that those moral concepts are tied into political economy. In Yasmin's paper, Faire la maman, also the probation officer speaking in that way. It doesn't have the same immediacy, at least for me, as does, say, Thompson's connection to political economy. Or even in Didier's paper, the public exposure of the arrested man's HIV status is, so the relationship to political economy, I think, requires some more work. Now, part of the answer, possibly, is a slight constructive criticism for some of the papers, namely that the papers took on the notion of a moral economy directly and didn't then push the analysis necessarily to the political economic domain, leaving us either with the feeling that these have been and always will be economic issues, or leaving the reader unsure as to what to do or think about them. Part of the answer, though, may be that the moral equations are, and this is recognizably so, the papers admit this, you hear this throughout the papers, complex. They're tensions. They are, c'est souvent conflictuel et parfois contradictoire, right? The moral economies are not intended to be coherent. The purpose is to show their tensions and paradoxes. I think this was brought up in the terrific intervention of Marc-Henri Soulet about the notion that there aren't good decisions, there aren't proper distances, there aren't real competences, right? And this is a constant struggle to achieve some kind of coherence out of a space that is, in some sense, incoherent. And so this could be just the complexity of the moral economy, which is impossibly complex and not always related or easily related to political economy. The case of the disclosure of HIV seems like an impossibly complex case, too. Of course, it's easy to talk about how it might have been badly done in this case, in public, etc. But the very question of whether one would ultimately expose a condition like that is morally complex in a way that doesn't necessarily automatically lend itself to an easy political economic connection. Part of the problem may be with the notion of morality and the level at which we're using the term moral in moral economy. And here it could be that there are some confusions as to the blurred edges of the domain or the field of economy versus political, moral versus political economy. Now, very quickly, what I would want to take account of are two other very closely linked phenomena in this relationship between moral economies and political economies. I don't think I'll have the time to flesh these out. But they are two concepts that I would say play a big role in producing some of the political economic effects, which are kind of, I would refer to them as collective imaginaries about the political economy that all of us share, right? That are in some sense entirely unexposed, hidden layers of belief systems that are possibly different than a moral economy and that are possibly different than explicit political economy. Some may be more political economic. One of them is the notion of prediction, right? The very idea that justice has revolved around a concept of prediction, predicting dangerousness and risk, I would argue, is something that we've all swallowed, but that inherently serves as a proxy for race, at least in the United States. And so I could give a history here of the way in which race was used as a prediction factor in the United States to predict dangerousness in the early part of the 20th century. How race becomes eliminated in the prediction models, how the prediction models start narrowing in more and more on one factor that becomes prior criminal history, and how prior criminal history or future dangerousness actually proxies for race, such that today we have all bought into this idea that prediction of future dangerousness is important to sentence length, and yet it's in some sense almost divorced from both moral economies and political economies, because we can't see this connection that has been elided over the 20th century between future dangerousness, prior criminal history, in a space where there's racial profiling and race. And the result, of course, over the 20th century in the United States is that we've gone from a prison population that was approximately 25% non-black at the beginning of the 20th century, and that is today over two-thirds one quarter non-white at the beginning of the 20th century, and is today two-thirds non-white, a continuous, constant increase in the non-white population in prison, in part, I believe, because of a form of internalized collective imaginary of future dangerousness that is itself divorced from moral economies and political economies. The other major factor, at least in the United States, is, I believe, this notion of what I refer to as the illusion of free markets, this notion of a kind of liberal economic bias, and this is clearly political economic, that has produced what I refer to as, or what others refer to as well as, neoliberal penality, clearly a form of rationality that is predominantly political economic, and that has had huge influences on the penal state in the United States, but which I don't necessarily place within the framework of moral economies. So let me recap the second point then on the relationship between moral economies and political economies. Donc, ce que j'ai essayé de dire, c'est que il fallait donc se tourner au concept, il me semble, d'économie politique pour miner le côté de la critique qu'on peut trouver dans l'approche des économies morales, mais que c'est moins évident, dans les cas qu'on a écoutés hier et aujourd'hui, que la relation directe avec l'économie politique que dans le cas de E.P. Thompson, et qu'il y a des fois des distances à essayer de bridge, des distances how do you say bridge? Combler. Des ponts à combler pour relier ces questions d'économie morale aux questions d'économie politique. Mais que pourtant, il me semble que souvent, et au moins dans le contexte américain, c'est pas nécessairement à travers l'économie morale que le travail se fait, mais des fois à travers des concepts qui ont une dimension ou bien moins morale parce qu'ils ont été plus profondément cachés. Donc ici c'est la dangerosité, par exemple, la dangerosité qui vient à remplacer le profilage racial, mais d'une manière complètement invisible, complètement inconsciente, et qui ne fait pas partie nécessairement d'une économie morale, mais qui est acceptée dans un imaginaire collectif, dans la conception même de la justice, ou bien des concepts fondamentalement plus d'économie politique, comme ce qu'on appelle la pénalité néolibérale, donc des conceptions américaines du rôle du gouvernement, d'une certaine incompétence en ce qui concerne l'économie et d'une certaine compétence en ce qui concerne le pénal. OK. Donc, des questions sur le rapport et les limites entre l'économie morale et l'économie politique. Troisièmement, et pour essayer de conclure, le concept de subjectivité morale. So this brings us to the third concept, moral subjectivities. And drawing on notions of governmentality, of governing of self and others in the later Foucault. This is unquestionably a powerful interpretive lens that's deployed successfully in many of these papers. In fact, from the first one on, Shaora's paper has a very strong notion of governing through the combination of harsh dissuasion and mercy that attempts to responsibilize, but it's a form of governing others. And it has a strong influence on a lot of our works. In fact, strongly influential on the notion, for instance, what I was just talking about, this idea of a collective imaginary that is, of course, accepted by all of us. All of us, rather than simply neoconservatives, right? The critique of neoliberalism and its participation is a critique of the way in which we have all come to believe, at least in the United States, we have all come to believe certain things about the competence of the state that is not unique to neoconservatives, but is actually accepted by most of the people in the United States. This notion of all of us, in some sense, governing ourselves in these ways is, I think, fits under this rubric of this third concept. Now, here in these collected works, the question that I would pose is how moral subjectivities differ from moral economies. What work is it doing beyond the framework of moral economies? And so, for instance, in Didier's paper from yesterday morning, it's written, elles peuvent être des exercices conscients résultant d'une réflexion autour d'un dilemme ou des gestes ordinaires précédant d'une simple attention, un mot de sympathie à l'adresse d'un étranger en situation irrégulière. So the question is, how does that differ? How does the subjectivity there differ? Or what are we getting at a different dimension? Or is that the very notion of a moral economy? Now, of course, there's a certain subjective element to this, but it's a subjective element that is woven into the notion of a moral economy. In other words, you can't have a moral economy without having subjective moral agents working on others and working on themselves. So the question is, paying attention to the subjective element of a moral code is a dimension of the moral economy, but is it something more than a dimension of the moral economy? Does it go further in its attempt to bring together, to consolidate, or to combine what would be a Thompson perspective, which was a kind of heavily influenced by the political economy, of course, of Marx, right, and the Frankfurt School, with a Foucauldian approach. So in other words, footnotes 9 and 10, right, one is Thompson and one is Foucault. And the question is Foucault woven into the moral economy, or is it producing another dimension? to it. Okay. Let me try and say that in French and then turn it over to Stephen. Donc, sur le troisième concept, la question que je poserais serait quel travail est-ce que l'idée de subjectivité morale fait au-delà du concept de l'économie morale. C'est sans doute une méthode interprétative très puissante, et on le voit dans les papiers. J'en ai parlé dans le papier de Shahara, par exemple, et bien sûr qui a une forte influence sur nous tous, et j'en ai parlé un peu sur le concept de l'imaginaire collectif, qui est une dimension subjective, bien sûr, dans la deuxième partie. Mais dans ce travail ici, je me demande, est-ce que c'est une dimension de l'économie morale ou est-ce que c'est quelque chose de différent? Est-ce que c'est absorbé par l'approche de l'économie morale? Est-ce que c'est simplement la partie subjective de l'interaction entre les agents, ou est-ce que c'est une dimension différente? Okay? Et donc la question ici, ce serait comment distinguer ce concept de subjectivité morale du concept de l'économie morale.